Good afternoon and evening, wherever you may be in the world, and welcome to this event sponsored by the Toby Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of History, and CREASE, the program. Somebody give me the correct acronym.
Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies.
Thank you so much. I am Shana Hammerman. I am the Associate Director at the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford, and I'm thrilled to have all of you here as we are about to delve into what is going to be a somber conversation. I encourage you during the program to enter any questions or comments you may have into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or into the chat function. And we will do our best to get to that by the end of the program. Before we delve in, I am honored to introduce Professor Norman Naimark, who is the Robert and Florence McDonald Professor of East European Studies at Stanford and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, among other accolades. He has published widely, most recently, Genocide, A World History, Stalin and the Fate of Europe. So he is also teaching this quarter at Stanford, the Holocaust Insights from New Research with his colleague, Professor Catherine Jellick. And we thank both of you for your initiative in bringing Dr. Martin Dean here to speak to us today virtually. So welcome to Norman, and thank you. I will turn off my video, but I'm here to communicate with you through chat and the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce two esteemed colleagues. Our speaker for today I'll introduce first and our commentator second. Our speaker is Martin Dean, who received his PhD from Queen's College in Cambridge and has worked as a researcher for the Special Investigations Unit in Sydney, Australia, and as a senior historian for the Metropolitan Police War Crimes Unit in London. As a research scholar at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, he was a volume editor of the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. He has a series of publications, very important ones, in Holocaust historiography. They include Collaboration in the Holocaust 2000 and Robbing the Jews 2008, which won a National Jewish Book Award in 2009. He's based in Bethesda, Maryland, works as a historical researcher for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, with which I'm also associated. His current research project, Shadows from the Valley of Death, is a detailed analysis of the Babyn Yar massacre, combining aerial photography, ground photographs, and witness testimony. It's quite spectacular work, and I'm very anxious to hear what he has to say today about it. Yulia Ilchuk is an assistant professor of Slavic literature and culture at Stanford. Her major research interests fall under the broad heading of cultural exchange, interaction, and borrowing between Russia and Ukraine. Her first book, Nikolai Gogol's Hybrid Performance, Toronto 2021, revises Gogol's identity in texts as ambivalent and hybrid by situating them in an in-between space between Russia and Ukraine, between Russian and Ukrainian cultures. Ilchuk's most recent book project, tentatively entitled Future in the Past, Memory, Culture, and Identity in Post-Soviet Russia and Ukraine, offers a comparative analysis of the parallel development of the two cultures through their rivalry over the control and dissemination of memory of the Soviet past and recent present. So without further ado, Martin, we turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Norma, for that very kind introduction. Just putting up my PowerPoint. In 1965, Elie Wiesel took a cab to Babyn Yar as he wanted to visit the site of the massacre in the infamous ravine on the edge of Kiev. This is what he saw. We continued for another 2 kilometers until we reached a broad open area. In the distance, there were new housing developments. On my right, a new highway. On my left, a construction site. The driver shrugged his shoulders, as if to explain, you can see with your own eyes there's nothing here. He was right. You have to close your eyes to see the thousands falling into an open grave. You have to concentrate with all your energy to hear their cries in this silence, which seems so restful and so natural. Where are the mass graves? Where is the blood? Does anything visible remain of that drama of horror? Nothing. Blue skies, a long smooth road, the movement of traffic, and the driver's smile. I stayed there for an hour, my feet glued to the ground, searching for a sign, a memorial of some kind. Nothing. There is nothing to see at Babyn Yar. In essence, this description of the scene at Babyn Yar still applies today. Although many memorials have now been erected, very little remains of the distinctive steep-sided ravines gouged out of the landscape. It has almost all been bulldozed flat. Instead, one is greeted by a peaceful park, confined on one side by a busy street. It is difficult to imagine what happened here. Today, I will examine the complex history of Babyn Yar. It serves as the most powerful symbol of the Shoah by bullets, the Nazi mass shootings of Jews on occupied Soviet territory. But even in 2019, many details of what happened were still shrouded in mystery. It was to resolve some of these unknowns that I engaged in a large-scale research project for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center almost 3 years ago. The largest mass shooting took place soon after Hitler ordered the Nazi security police to expand the target of their operations to include Jewish women and children. And it encompassed the destruction of the Jewish population of an entire city over just 2 days. Using photographs, witness testimonies, and aerial images, I will reconstruct the route taken by the Jews into the ravine and identify the location of the mass shootings. By following the discarded property and clothing of the Jews captured in contemporary photographs, this leads us like a trail of breadcrumbs to the site where the massacre took place. We will also examine the responses of individual Jews along the route and the measures taken by the Germans to confiscate Jewish property. Finally, we will examine German efforts to conceal and destroy the mass graves, as well as the post-war Soviet denial of the Jewish identity of the majority of victims at Babyn Yar. The Einsatzgruppen were the SS and police squads that followed the army into the Soviet Union to deal with declared enemies. These squads kept detailed records of their mass shootings that added up to more than 1 million victims in total by mid-1942. The reports give the place, date, and number of victims for their shooting operations. Those shot are described mostly as Jews. Einsatzgruppen report number 106 states abruptly that 33,771 Jews were shot at Babyn Yar on September the 29th to 30th, 1941. By August 1941, mass shootings were an almost daily occurrence for members of the Einsatzgruppen. The method used in late June and July for smaller mass shootings resembled the procedures of a firing squad. The mobile Einsatzgruppen were specially designed teams totaling about 3,000 men, consisting of security police officers, guards supplied by the Waffen-SS and order police, and many police drivers who also participated in the shootings. In addition, there were translators and other support staff, some of whom were ethnic Germans recruited locally. The Einsatzgruppen were supported also by police battalions, local auxiliaries, and the Wehrmacht. From the start, the Einsatzgruppen targeted Jewish intelligentsia, but increasingly also Jewish men of military age between 18 and 45. From mid-August, one Einsatzgruppe asked for another, started to expand the killings to include women and children. By September 1941, complete Jewish communities were to be exterminated in newly occupied towns and cities. The German security police used deception to encourage the Jews to report and to facilitate their murderous plans. Following the mass shooting of more than 20,000 Jews in Kamenets Podolsky in late August, there were also mass shootings conducted in Zhytomyr, Berdichev, Vinnytsia, and all in September 1941. Then on September 19th, the German army entered Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, after a prolonged battle in which the city became encircled. The battle north of Kiev bought some time for the Soviets to evacuate industrial workers, some industry, and government officials out of the city. Among them were large numbers of Jews. Likely more than 100,000 Jews managed to evacuate, leaving some 50,000 behind. The evacuation of industry by the Soviets was a major accomplishment, which enabled them to resume key production further east. Jews were not given priority in the evacuations, but many of them escaped from Kiev nonetheless. Conditions for the evacuees, however, were still very harsh. For example, as a railroad employee, Führer Schwarz's father was evacuated with his family at the beginning of July 1941. They could only take very little luggage. Führer recalled, "We only took the most necessary clothing, my toys and children's books, my bed linen, and a few pots." They were evacuated to Magnitogorsk, but soon her father was called up to the Red Army and was killed at the front. My mother and I were starving and freezing because we didn't have any winter clothes. In early 1943, Führer's mother died of pneumonia. Her grandfather remained behind in Kiev and was killed at Babyn Yar. Due to the war, Führer became an orphan. Some Jews, such as Sarah Schulman, was sent soon after the German invasion to dig trenches in the vicinity of Kiev for several weeks. As she explained, "I was a Soviet person, they told us to go, and so we went." On her return, her parents had already been evacuated. Then she fled Kiev just in time and served with a nursing unit near the front. Later, she was evacuated to Central Asia. We went on a freight train. Our trip lasted for over a month until we arrived in Uzbekistan, 3,000 kilometers from Kiev. We rented a hut from an Uzbek man who allowed us to pick tomatoes from his garden. The local population was friendly and we didn't face any anti-Semitism. On returning to Kiev in 1944, she found that her grandparents had been killed at Babyn Yar. German forces arrived in Kiev on September 19th, 1941. On September 24th, several large explosions wrecked buildings used by the German military along Kiev's main street, Kreshchatyk. They were caused by mines set off by the Soviet security service, killing dozens of people. The resulting fires burned for a week, together with German containment measures, caused widespread damage in the city. Thousands of people were made homeless. This is an image from 1943, and as you can see, some whole blocks were completely knocked down after the fires had been extinguished. And you can see the damage. These are other buildings where the roofs have obviously come off in the fire. On September 25th to 27th, SS and Wehrmacht commanders held meetings in Kiev. They decided to murder the city's Jews as a reprisal for the recent explosions. Placards calling on all Jews to present themselves at a specific road junction near Babinya were posted around the city by the Ukrainian police on September 28th. The threatened punishment for non-compliance was death. The Jews speculated as to what it could mean. Some feared the worst, but most expected that there would be some form of resettlement, perhaps by rail. Jewish teenager Vera Bogutska noted, "We lived at Tarasivska, number 8A, apartment 19. We discussed the placards. Most people were of the opinion that we'd be sent away to work. My mother packed up our things. I saw that the streets were full of people carrying luggage. Some of them had carts. They were all going in one direction. Towards evening, my mother and I left our apartment with our luggage. We went down several streets with many other people. The collection point was near the Jewish burial grounds. In response to the placards, more than 20,000 Jews took to the streets of Kiev on September 29th. This photograph, taken by a German in Kiev at the time, is inscribed on the back, "Jews taking their last journey on earth." Even at Babyn Yar, it is important to think of the Holocaust as a process composed of several stages. Raoul Hilberg has described the four main stages as definition, concentration, confiscation, and then destruction. As we see, the events at Babyn Yar followed roughly the same pattern, only the events and processes that were spread over some 10 years in Germany were compressed into just 2 days at Babyn Yar. Here we can see a 3D model reconstruction of the first German checkpoint that was created by the Center for Spatial Technologies in Kiev, using available data about the local terrain. The checkpoint is described vividly by Jewish survivor Genya Batasheva. So we walked a short distance past Pugachev Street, and there on both sides stood anti-tank hedgehogs, with a passageway down the middle. A lot of things were already scattered next to these anti-tank hedgehogs. Right in front of this, people were already throwing down such heavy portable things. This was the place where non-Jews accompanying friends and relatives had to turn back. Vehicles could go no further, and the Jews had to continue on foot with only what they could carry in their hands. From here on, the Jews were more closely guarded with little chance of escape. Rebecca Schwarzman and her family were accompanied to the checkpoint by a non-Jewish neighbor and her two daughters. The Germans were armed with machine guns, and some were on motorbikes. One of the non-Jewish women was carrying Rebecca's one-year-old son as they reached the checkpoint. As the fair-haired baby boy was being returned to Rebecca, the German guard asked if she was Jewish. Yes, she said. But the guard insisted, the pretty blonde boy must go back. He then indicated to Rebecca and her sister that they should flee. Rebecca extracted herself from the crowd with the boy and made her way to one of the cemeteries, where she hid in a crypt for the rest of the day, breastfeeding her son to keep him quiet. So I will also quote from some of the German guards and members of the police units involved. One of them, Leonard Puchter, the driver for Sonderkommando 4A, recalled, I drove out of Kiev and came to an alley. There was a checkpoint which let me through. I saw that along this alley, Jews were marching. They were going in groups as if for a stroll. On the left lay an enormous pile of luggage, which was about 3 meters by 2 meters. It looked like a huge pile of potatoes. The Jews threw their luggage onto this pile. At the end of the alley, on the right, there was an open area where the registration took place. So the spatial tech team of 3D modelers in Kiev not only uses maps and aerial photographs, but also these contemporary photographs to reconstruct the scenes along the route to Babyn Yar. These scenes will be included inside a new 3D model center, which will be opening later this year. It will be called the Kurgan, and it will be actually based underground, not far from the main part of Babyn Yar. At the end of the alley of trees, the Jews were forced to surrender their documents and then were formed into groups for the next stage of the journey. Some were transported by truck and others marched on foot through a brutal narrow corridor of guards and into the sand quarry. So this is a view from above of the alley of trees taken in 1943. And the picture we saw looking down the alley was looking this way. And if you enlarge it, you can actually see this house at the end of the alley of trees. And I think the Germans also put up a fence, you might see the shadow of it here, to sort of contain the Jews as they were marching down the alley. And further on, probably up here on the right, would be where the registration place took place in a more open area. So why didn't the Jews do more to resist? In Kiev, most were women, children, and the elderly, as almost all men of military age had already been conscripted or evacuated. Then there was the high level of deception practiced by the Germans, which carefully concealed the real aim of the order for the Jews to assemble. Many Jews thought they would be transported via the freight railway station close to the cemeteries. As a result, most Jews came to realize their fate only too late, when they began to hear the shots. By then, they were already within the tight police cordon that offered almost no chance of escape. Nonetheless, there were a few miraculous escapes. Reuven Stein, a Jewish teenager at the time, recalls, from the first steps of our journey, I began to look for a possibility to escape from the column, but how and in what manner? The column was escorted by armed Nazis. When there was only 250 or 300 meters remaining to Babyn Yar, I jumped unnoticed out of the column into the ditch alongside the road and crawled into a drainage canal that ran under the street and sat there until it was dark. Later, I climbed out on the other side of the street and went through the old cemetery to the edge of the city. In the night, I then made my way home. Of course, this was just the start of a long odyssey for Reuven to survive the war, but it shows it was possible for a few to escape. So this shows the main route taken by most of the Jews. A few may have followed other routes, but for quite a lot of the time, it came this way up Melnikov Street, and then passes Pugachev Street, which is back here, I think. These are garages and army training base, which was used to hold some of the Jews overnight. And then here they turn left down what was called for a time Kahatna Street, and then onto Dorogozhitska Street, which is the alley of trees. And then up to this point, the route is fairly well known, but here you see the main ravine starts. It's not quite clear whether they traversed along this side or went down here. Some also probably went by truck along this road and then were taken to the sand quarry this way through a road that enters down this way, probably dropped off here from the trucks. Most probably went up the main ravine here and then made their way to the sand quarry here on foot. And this is probably where the corridor took place. Rubinstein probably ducked down one of these narrow ravine channels that for some reason was unguarded as you went past it. So not many people escaped that way. On reaching Babyn Yar, the Nazis stood in 2 rows tightly next to each other, each creating a living corridor along which they drove the people, doomed to death in a continuous stream. In this area, I stayed with my father. I do not remember exactly where, but at one point there were still many ravines, and here the guards were standing further apart. Seeing this, my father pushed me into one of the ravines and followed me. We went out of the ravine to the cemetery, where we waited until late at night and then left for my father's house. So that was another survivor apart from Rubinstein, Yevgeny Yekel. And his account is the main one that convinces me, provisionally at least, that they probably went down the ravine itself. The main clues we have about the route of the Jews after this are a series of photographs taken shortly after the massacre by the German propaganda photographer Johannes Haller. The motive of these photographs is not quite clear, but it certainly documents quite well the scene on the day after, or in the days after the massacre. So where were the Haller photographs taken? The Haller photographs show vast piles of clothing in what looks like a sand quarry, and also Soviet POWs covering over the ground in a long, steep-sided ravine. This was the difficult research goal that the BYHMC team had set itself in 2019 to locate where these photographs were taken. To correctly identify the shooting ravine with the POWs, I used a very distinctive tree on the skyline, which I called the lone tree, which is visible also on a number of photographs taken from the main ravine. And here it's shown on an aerial photograph looking from above. So it sits on this curved crest here, and there are a number of photographs looking down the ravine, which shows it quite clearly, starkly against the skyline. It's strangely, it could not be seen initially on the key Haller photograph. Although the crescent-shaped cliff is visible in the distance, at first glance, it does not appear that we can see the lone tree on the Haller image. Yet if you enlarge the cliff top, you can see the lone tree on the edge of the cliff. It is concealed from a distance by the stand of trees behind it. Literally, you cannot see the tree for the woods behind it. So here's the tree in case you can't see it. So this confirms that the Haller ravine is different from the main ravine, as it has quite a different angle on the lone tree, demonstrated by the contrasting backgrounds. By using aerial photography, we were then able to pinpoint where Haller was standing on the road at the end of the western spur, close to where the Syriets camp was later built. By enlarging the aerial photo, we were also able to identify the sand quarry, which lies between the 2 branches of the ravine of Babyn Yar. So it has 2 branches that meet more or less at this point here, and the sand quarry is in between them here. Its location had been difficult to ascertain before, as it is missing from almost all maps, including the 1924 topographical survey used to construct the 3D model. The reason for this is that the sand quarry itself was only created in the late 1930s and had disappeared with changes in the landscape after 1950, when a new road was built through the area. The shifting sands of Babyn Yar served to sow confusion that has confounded historians for years. Most of the Jews were forced to undress in the sand quarry. This is confirmed both by witness statements and by the Haller photographs. This overhead view has been prepared using the 3D model created by Spatial Tech and enables us to determine the position of the discarded clothing as seen in the Haller photographs. It seems to indicate that the bulk of the Jews walked around towards the left. In fact, they probably ascended up on a path either this way or this way to get through this notch. And then this is the western spur where most of the mass shooting took place. So on entering the sand quarry, the Jews were then driven into the left corner to enter the western spur up a slope and through a specially created passageway, the Notch. Albin Pover, a German policeman present in the sand quarry during the shootings, testified, in the ensuing hollow, there were throngs of assembled Jews. The Jews had to undress at the end of the quarry when partly naked in their underclothes over a steep slope and disappeared into the adjacent valley or behind a mountain slope. From there, one could hear shooting. This map shows the likely location of shootings in the Western Spur. As many as 3 or 4 separate shooting squads were operating along the length of this branch of the ravine. When taking his photograph, Haler was standing at the end of the Western Spur, at this end here, looking down the length of the shooting ravine to take his iconic photograph of the POWs covering over the ground on the following day. It should be noted actually also that the walls of the ravine were exploded by German military engineers after the mass shooting was over, and this is how they covered over most of the bodies, but then they still brought in POWs to smooth over the ground afterwards. So this is the view after the sides had been blown up, and we could tell that there had been some quite dramatic alterations to the sides by comparing this image with the original 3D model, which was based on a 1924 topographical survey. So the sides have actually got steeper, and you can probably see this looks like fresh sand exposed on the 2 sides here. So this image also matches the description by a German driver, Victor Trill, who was standing on roughly the same spot during the actual shooting, and also draws a sketch map. And here you can see the top of the sand quarry just in the distance behind the telegraph pole. So the notch where most of the Jews entered is probably around here. Trill's description is, looking from the bridge, the depression made a turn to the right, where behind this curve, a large round depression in the ground was located. It's the sand quarry. It's possible that this comprised a former sand or gravel pit. In this pit, there were also countless people who I can safely assume were all Jews. Also in this pit were mountains of clothing of all sorts. Most Jews entered by the notch in the middle of the Western Spur. This was also likely the spot from which Dina Pranicheva and other Jews fell into the ravine from above. A few Jews may have descended into the main ravine on the right to enter the Western Spur from its junction with the main ravine. And this would allow for shootings to take place between the groups of shooters without endangering people, although it is quite steep down this part of the ravine, so it's unclear to what extent they were used. In fact, this thing here can be seen as like a berm. This was built in late 1941, we believe, to sort of prevent bodies washing down as water did flow through the ravine and sort of revealed corpses and washed bodies down. The Germans built this to try and sort of stop body parts being washed down into the main ravine. And certainly indicates that there must have been shootings along this part, certainly. So the famous witness Dina Pranicheva gave evidence of the mass shooting at the Kiev trial. She was a survivor who literally crawled out of the grave. She reports, in the evening, a German officer arrived and said that we should all be shot. As if even one person got away from here, they would talk, and the next day not a single Jew would appear. We were all led to be shot at the sandy notch. But we were not forced to undress because it was growing dark and the Germans were tired. Coming out of the so-called door from this notch to the left, there was a small ledge where all the people formed up and were executed from the opposite side with machine guns. People fell into a very, very deep abyss. I shut my eyes, squeezed my fists, and threw myself down before a shot came. Of course, it seemed to me that I was flying a whole eternity because I was very high up. I felt neither pain when I was falling nor the impact, nothing. My only wish was to live. Pranicheva subsequently crawled out from the pile of bodies and managed to survive. This document sent by Sonderkommando 4A from Kiev lists hundreds of items of jewelry that were collected from Jews as they took their last steps into the ravine at Babyn Yar. The list includes 63 ladies' watches, more than 300 rings, and 95 decorative chains, weighing in total more than 2.5 kilograms. This was probably just a fraction of the total collected there. It's one of dozens of reports I found in the archives of the War Booty Office soon after the fall of the wall of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s. In this photo, we see members of the SS searching the discarded clothing of Jews at Babyn Yar for any hidden valuables. During the shooting itself, the Germans changed their procedure. They had been searching the Jews individually for valuables, and then they changed the policy to get them all to undress, basically so they could look for the valuables afterwards to save time because there was such a mass of people coming. The clothing itself was also transported away in trucks and stored in warehouses for distribution to needy ethnic Germans or for sale to the local population. Of course, there was also private theft on a massive scale that accompanied the official looting. Police battalion members recall sorting vast piles of ruble notes. So Hala also took some close-up photographs of discarded clothing. Note the photograph of a loved one left lying in the sand, captured by Hala's camera the day after the shooting. The furniture left behind in Jewish apartments in Kiev was also confiscated by the German occupation authorities. This meant that non-Jews who moved into the apartments in late 1941 had to register any property left behind. They were then given the option of either purchasing it or handing it over to German authorities. In this document, a local resident agrees to purchase former Jewish furniture and to pay for it in 6 monthly installments. Among the items purchased are one dining table, one bookcase, one small table, and one bed with a mattress. There was also a buffet, a child's bed, and a sofa. In April 1942, commander of the security police in Kiev, Erich Erlinger, established a work education camp at Sirets near Babyn Yar, so directly opposite to the shooting ravine. Prisoners not sentenced to death were to be re-educated there through hard labor. In practice, it became a major torture center where hundreds of inmates died from the conditions or were killed. In its final phase, some of the prisoners, including Jews, were used to burn the corpses and cover the traces of German mass killings at Babyn Yar. This was part of a huge effort started in 1943 called Special Operation 1005. It was led by Paul Blobel, who had also organized the original massacre of Jews at Babyn Yar in 1941. He was tasked with trying to erase all the mass graves in the East, but due to lack of time, this was only partially completed. Apart from around 15 prisoners that escaped, all the others involved in burning corpses at Babyn Yar were shot on the completion of their work. So this enlargement of an aerial photograph taken actually on September the 26th, 1943, 2 days before the mass escape that had allowed some of the Jewish and other Soviet prisoners working on the exhumations to escape, reveals 2 bunkers here, which exactly match the descriptions of guards and prisoners. You can see there's a step down at the front, which is marked by a shadow. There's not much of a shadow from the bunkers as they're kind of built into the ground, so they're only just poking up above the ground. But here you see the shadow of a guard tower that may have been transported from the Sirets camp and was used to guard the entrance. And even during the breakout, a machine gun was firing from this guard tower as they tried to escape. And only the fact that it jammed after a while allowed some to escape successfully. The testimony of the few escaped prisoners about how the graves in Babyn Yar were exhumed and burned also provides vital evidence regarding the locations of the mass shootings at Babyn Yar. Yevgeny Yevtushenko wrote his famous poem, Babyn Yar, after his trip to Kiev with the author of the novel of the same name, Anatoly Kuznetsov, in August 1961. The opening line, "No monument stands over Babyn Yar," was an indictment of Soviet suppression of information about the Holocaust. The poem became a rallying cry for Jews and other writers who gathered regularly at the site for commemorations in the following years, despite strong discouragement and repression by the Soviet authorities. The Soviet memorial was eventually completed in 1976, but it referred to the victims only as peaceful Soviet citizens, continuing the Soviet policy of concealing the Holocaust. Or certainly it's the fact that it was Jews who were mainly targeted by the Nazis. So this was the main memorial to the Jewish victims at Babyn Yar when I visited in 2017. Last time I was there, it was surrounded by a huge tent, and this is where the 3 presidents, Zelensky and also the President of Germany, the President of Israel gave their speeches, and a concert was given of the Shostakovich Symphony, also entitled Babyn Yar. So recently installed were viewing stones at the sites of some of Hela's photographs. So the idea, and this was actually Karol Berkow's idea, who was the original organizer of the project, was to take the Hela photographs, find the location where he was standing, and then allow you to look at the photographs in exactly the place where he was standing when he took them. And there are now at least 3 of these stones marking the place. This one actually is kind of in a slightly wooded area, but there is a road which is covering part of the actual shooting site. And there is a place where the main Hela photograph, which looks down the ravine, can't actually be located because a building has been built there actually fairly recently to prevent that from happening. So unfortunately, our memory politics have come a little bit too late, because some of the places where we want to put the stones are really owned by private buildings. So, but even so, it's now possible to see exactly where Hela was standing for several of his iconic photographs. Very impressive too is this folding synagogue, which was created at the idea of Robert Jan van Pelt, another historian working for the Memorial Center, and has been used to hold services regularly by the great rabbi of Ukraine and the Jewish community there. This is an image of the planned kurgan, where the 3D model will be built underground. It will be below ground level, and it will show an overview of the ravine as it existed in 1941. And I think there will also be places where you can see some of the scenes along the route in one form or another. It's not quite clear to me exactly what it would look like, but the actual 3D model itself will be very large, as much as 20 or 30 meters across. There's also a mirror field, which is an art exhibition, which was installed early in 2021. And finally, just before the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the mass shooting, this crying wall was installed as a special monument. It has the ability for literally water to run down it, and the crystals themselves are also meant to give people some inspiration when they're basically mourning at this site. Thank you very much for your careful attention, and I look forward to Julia's comments.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. Can everybody hear me or not? Okay, thank you, Martin. That was fascinating. Now, Julia, please. Thank you. Go ahead, Julia.
Thank you, Norman, for introducing me. Can you hear me? There is no delay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Martin. I want to provide a couple remarks and ask my questions as a literary scholar. Please excuse me for such a naivety, but I'm also working on the contested history of Holocaust in Ukrainian literature. So that's why the nature of my questions are purely literary. Dr. Martin Dean's research on reconstructing the tragedy of Babyn Yar using witnesses' testimonies and photographic images is a significant contribution to the development of multi-directional memory of the Holocaust in Ukraine at the very crucial historical moment. The number of the research institutions, conferences, graduate programs on Jewish and Holocaust studies established in Ukraine in the years following the Revolution of Dignity can only compete with the number of similar institutions founded in Germany and Lithuania. Yet the Ukrainian academic and intellectual community has been torn by the debates about appropriateness of memorialization of Babyn Yar tragedy by Russian subjects. So I won't go into details, but all of us understand what I mean. One can argue that such a resistance to the scholarly and artistic projects of Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center has its roots in the shielded memory of the Holocaust in Ukraine. So as we know, between 1941 and 1943, 1.5 million Jews perished in Ukraine, yet a full understanding of how the tragedy has been suppressed first by nationalist ideologies and interpretations of history, and then by Soviet, by minimizing the tragedy to the one of the many atrocities of Second World War. In Soviet time, admitting the existence of the Holocaust would undermine the concept of Soviet people, but similar logic of oneness was applied in the ideological formation of an independent Ukraine. During the first decade or so of Ukraine independence, the issue of properly memorializing the Jewish tragedy at Babyn Yar was actively, if not always positively, debated. During the first president, Leonid Kravchuk, in his speech at the 50th anniversary of the Babyn Yar, had apologized for Ukrainians' collaboration with the Nazis in the massive destruction of Jews. During President Viktor Yushchenko's tenure in the early 2000s, the idea of one Ukrainian people was officially buttressed by a new interpretation of history, one in which the 20th century in Ukraine was a decade-long battle for the liberation of Ukrainian people. The interest to the vanishing memory of the Jews murdered during Second World War on the territory of contemporary Ukraine has been revived right after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, when Ukrainian society began to work on the creation of inclusive memory of its past. In 2020, the debates around the construction of Babyn Yar Holocaust Museum Memorial Center exposed the new crisis of the collective memory and national identity in Ukraine, now defined by its inspirations to join the European Union. Various forms of official commemoration of the Holocaust, as well as recognition of local Ukrainian participation in it, have become a kind of precondition for Ukraine's entry into the European Union. Dr. Martin Dean's project on reconstructing where exactly the SS and auxiliary police conducted the mass shootings at Babyn Yar examines both the sites of violence and the shifting landscape of memory using various media. And showing how unstable the very concept of memory site is, and how it's important to restore the topography of Babyn Yar to secure a proper remembrance of the Holocaust in Ukraine. Seen through the perspective of Jewish victims, it's important to reconstruct not only the site of mass shooting, but also the precise route taken by the Jews on those 2 days. The eyewitnesses' accounts can be handy in this task. So my question first is how do the new evidences collected by one of the projects of Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, I mean the project called Voices, help you to reconstruct the route? Whether there were new evidences recorded recently that can eliminate your discovery? Have you consulted the literary works such as you mentioned Anatoly Kuznetsov, Babyn Yar, the novel chronicle, Katya Petrovskaya, maybe Esther, and different poems written in 1941 by eyewitnesses of Babyn Yar? Can we rely on those kind of semi-fictional or auto-fictional writing to restore the historical route? Also, how the footage presented in Sergei Loznitsa's recent documentary, Babyn Yar, The Context, can be helpful in your reconstruction? And how do the experience of other scholars who work on reconstructed the topography of mass extermination of Jews in Eastern Europe can be useful in your project? How do your findings be utilized in creating a virtual reality experience in the future memorial? So is there any kind of collaboration with that unit that's working on the tour? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yulia. Martin, you want to go ahead and address those questions? And then
I'll pick a few that I fancy. There was quite a flood of questions at the end, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer all of them. There was a question about the new evidence being found currently by a number of projects. I do work quite closely with Galinada Grinchenko, and we do exchange quite a bit of information. And some of her work on the oral histories has been very useful to me, although I can't say that I've I've got all the most recent ones, but there is a problem now that many of the people who were alive to speak about it today were literally very small children at the time of the event. So I'm not expecting new oral histories to reveal a lot in terms of details about what happened in 1941, but of course it's still very important to get what they have, and often they can retell the stories of their parents, their grandchildren, their grandparents, and they can give us a lot more context and understand how people have sort of experienced the memory of it. So I definitely think it was a great idea that what Galinard is doing, and it's very important to keep that going. I also work a lot with Father Patrick Dubois, who's now become more closely involved recently with the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. He did find one or two key witnesses in the early 2000s, including one who was on the site where the Syriac camp was later built, but was actually kind of a military base at the time. And they had a direct look into the ravine. So that actually helped me to corroborate what I was finding from the other sources. And that's really how this project has been working, that I haven't relied on one source or one testimony, but sort of seeing where they're all converging, how they're interlocking to give me a pretty clear and positive view that what I'm saying is more or less true. There are, of course, things that we don't know, and we have to recognize that. And there had been a lot of topographical work done before by Nakmanovich, for example, who found excellent testimonies in the KGB archives from the 1980s, which gave us a very clear view of the route up to till when they get to Babyn Yar. The problem is that the KGB then drew maps based on the incorrect terrain after the war, and those maps were more confusing than helpful to poor Nakmanovich when he tried to use them to find out where the shooting took place. So he miscalculated the actual spot. And similarly, Drobiatsko did an excellent job as well. He was the first one to use aerial photographs, and he got a lot of the details right, but because he wasn't using the German testimonies that I've been using, he wasn't quite able to figure out what happens from the sand quarry. So he more or less got them to the sand quarry, but then he wasn't sure which part of the ravine the shooting was in. And there were other people in the 2000s who came to more or less the same conclusions that I did. You have images from just after the war where people point into the ravine and you can see it's the same ravine. It's more that some of the memory had been lost by the destruction of the landscape than that we didn't really know what happened. But I think we do now have a much clearer picture by bringing these sources literally from all over the world together into one place and using the different media in a way that haven't been done before. There are similar projects. A good one is on Ponari very recently, which does actually a very similar job, because there too the site of memory has been changed over the years since the war, so that there was to some extent incorrect information about where things took place because pieces of it had disappeared. But then they used aerial photography and other sources, particularly witness testimony and some very good photographs, to sort of piece together that landscape more precisely. So it's kind of forensic work. It actually piggybacks a bit off the kind of war crimes work I was doing, where we're really trying to find everything we could out about a single mass shooting or a single town during World War II. And for me, it's really at the cutting edge of how history can be using new media and also drawing on its own qualities of interpreting testimonies, using vast archives to give an accurate description. But of course, there's also a lot of emotion involved in this, and I do want to focus a lot on the Jewish victims and the perspective of others who managed to escape, just so we can put it into its broader context of how terrible this event was.
Thank you, Martin. You know, if I might, I'm going to ask a quick question, which is more for the information of our audience and especially the students. What does the scholarship say now about first of all, how many people altogether during the war were buried in Babyn Yar? In other words, it wasn't just the 34,000 who died in that massacre. And how many of those were Jews? What do we know about that? And what's the contemporary state of the scholarship? Also, how many Ukrainians are there? There was this question of nationalist Ukrainians also being shot and, interred in Babyn Yar, as it were. And, do we know more about that? And the final question about Ukrainians, which is controversial, and you've worked a lot on this subject, so maybe you can help us with this, is to what extent did Ukrainians participate in the massacre itself, or were they just, helping the Germans along with the transport of the Jews? I mean, what is the latest scholarship? And maybe the final thing is to say, how's the museum going to do all this? I mean, how are they going to include these difficult Ukrainian questions, both burial of their own people there, and also, the fact that some of the perpetrators, as it were Ukrainian. How is that working out in your view?
Those are all excellent questions. I'll try to keep it brief. I think Karol Berkow has done pioneering work on this, and I more or less agree with him that we're actually downscaling the total number of people who were killed in and around Babyn Yar. It's very hard to calculate it accurately, but I've kind of got various ways of estimating the numbers who were shot by the security police after Babyn Yar. And although it was in the thousands, it probably wasn't more than 10 or 15,000 at the most. The sort of maximum capacity of the Syriets camp was about 3,000 people. The sort of maximum capacity of the security police headquarters was about 300 people. So given those limitations, you're not going to get through another 50,000 even in 2 years. It's more like 10 to 15,000, I think. And of those, probably only a few hundred were Ukrainian nationalists. In terms of Ukrainian participation at Babyn Yar, it's actually less than a lot of other sites that I've studied for a number of different reasons. Most of the actual shooting does seem to have been done by Germans here, which was more or less the practice in most places. There weren't too often that they ordered the Ukrainians to sort of do the mass shooting. The Ukrainian job was often when the ghettos were being liquidated to search the ghetto houses, to escort people to the shooting sites, and then to hunt down those who were trying to flee, or especially to look in the forest for them. And I don't know if people are familiar with, for example, the Synagogue case in Britain there. It was a Belarusian case, but the policeman, he then took off small groups of Jews and shot them more or less on his own after the main ghetto liquidation. So in Kiev, because it happened so early in the occupation, the Germans were just in the process of establishing Ukrainian police there. Most of the Ukrainian policemen who were at Babyn Yar seem to have come from Western Ukraine, although they did expand the Ukrainian police very quickly, or the German Ukrainian police, of course, it should be called, soon after that. But they were involved probably in this narrow corridor, beating people towards Babyn Yar, and they seem to have been involved also in forcing the Jews to undress. That's mentioned by Jewish survivors. So we do have that perspective as well, although there's not much about the Ukrainian collaborators from the Germans who were there, although they do mention that some Ukrainians were present. But it seems the actual shooting in the ravine was done almost exclusively by Germans at this time. So that's as far as I can tell from the sources I've used. But of course, throughout the occupation, the Ukrainian auxiliary police in Kiev was very crucial to a number of different persecution operations, although again, most of the shootings does seem to have been done by the security police, or there was also an ethnic German guard unit that came from ethnic Germans from Odessa region who supported some of the mass shootings at Babyn Yar. In terms of the museum representing all this, they have a very ambitious plan, which is still somewhat in the distance. So we'll see how much of it they'll be able to realize, which includes a number of different institutes and museums to various different parts of Holocaust and also Ukrainian history. So there will be a museum exhibit to deal with the whole of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, as well as another section dealing mainly, obviously, with Babyn Yar and the Kiev region. They are using a multimedia approach. I have been involved in that to some extent. They kind of seized on some of my research very early on and used it to develop this 3D model project. And I've been working together with the 3D models on that. I'm fairly happy with how that's working. Similarly, I'm not worried about the being any attempt to exclude Ukrainian participation from the exhibits. I think that will be covered, but of course it will be part of a huge museum exhibit, so it may not be the first thing that people encounter when they enter the door. But at the moment, I've not seen any problems in that respect in terms of trying to shift the narrative one way or another. People are free to read the narrative that Karol Berkow prepared while he was chief historian, and that deals very fairly with the issue of Ukrainian collaboration, not overemphasizing it, but giving it its due as part of the history, mentioning things like the Holodomor and especially the Soviet suppression of information about the crimes afterwards as well.
Good, thank you. Shana, are you gonna?
Hi,
Okay.
yes, thank you, Yulia, Norman, and especially Martin. I'm going to facilitate some Q&A. If anybody has a question, please enter it into the Q&A function or into the chat. But because I have the mic, so to speak, I'm going to ask the first question, which is one that I have. You mentioned this, the 1943 cover-up of the massacre, and I'm wondering if you have insight into the motivation behind the desire to cover up, for whom they were covering, and if this is an indication of some kind of shame at the horror, the particular horror of these events, or if it's some other type of a strategic effort.
It's fairly straightforward. It was a sort of both sides, both the Soviets and the Nazis were trying to expose each other's crimes and try to cover up their own crimes. The Germans very shamelessly tried to blame Katyn on the Soviets, so the Soviets tried to blame Katyn on the Germans. Sorry, I got that the wrong way around. And when the Soviets started recovering areas from German control, they immediately put people on trial, exposed pictures of the mass graves. And of course, the Germans didn't want to use this because it was being used to obviously to motivate the Soviet people to fight more against Germany. So they did institute this huge program. It was actually planned already in 1942 to an early stage. And the aim was to literally dig up and crush and burn and destroy the physical evidence, so the human corpses, which means there probably are relatively few human remains in Babyn Yar in intact form, at least today, because it was relatively successful there. I think they may have missed one or two mass graves because there were so many in and around Babyn Yar, and we haven't been able really to locate exactly where the ones are that they missed. But in the main ravine itself, they knew where the corpses were, and they spent 6 weeks digging them up most laboriously. They even took headstones from the Jewish cemetery to build pyres and poured oil on the corpses. I mean, it was absolutely disgusting work to pile this up and then burn it. And the smoke from the fires spread over the city. People complained about it. There are witness reports about that. So these are all the kind of things I'm also including in my book to show how much people knew about this even at the time. That the fire brigade was called when they first started burning the fires because people couldn't understand what the terrible smell was coming from the west of the city. So the cover-up actually is one of the most revealing things about the massacre. That's one of the ironies of it.
Thank you. Okay, one of our guests asks, Dr. Dean, you spoke of a war booty office where you found the documents of jewelry stolen by the Germans. Where might those documents be today? And thank you for all the work you've done before and now.
The war booty office I stumbled across in Berlin soon after the Berlin Wall came down. The reason was it had been in the East German archives up until 1990 and had been used by very few historians there. Quite a few of my colleagues, people like Christian Gerlach, also got in there soon afterwards in 1991, 1992. But I did go through it fairly systematically and found a number of reports from not only Einsatzgruppen, but all the other different types of German units involved in shooting Jews. The Wehrmacht had reports there, including one. I later interviewed the person who signed the document, if you can believe that. And he actually told me the wrong story, that he tried to deliver the property, but the people in that office wouldn't receive it. It must have been another occasion when he successfully delivered it because he did sign it. So I have been able to verify that these documents do literally report the property. And it's amazing how open they are. Some of them speak quite clearly from Jews who have been shot. So it's another example of however hard people try, there's always some evidence that a crime took place. And it's like the halo photographs. Once you understand the context, they really are very revealing. And that was part of the story for me, that the halo photographs for a long time had been a kind of mystery, but when you can locate exactly where they took place and what the terrain looked like and what all the German policemen who were there the day before describe, and it all matches up, then it's really like as I said, a trail of breadcrumbs that leads you to where it took place.
Thank you. Okay, another attendee asks, thank you for this presentation. I'd like to ask a question about contemporary memory politics on the ground. On the one hand, you showed pictures of not one, but several impressive memorials that were recently installed or are planned. On the other hand, you mentioned that recent construction has prevented the completion of the Viewing Stone project. Could you elaborate a bit on how the theme of memory is seen or debated on the local level, e.g. in the local press or local politics? How much local support, indifference, or hostility do you see there?
Well, it's a very complicated situation, and I can't claim to be really an expert on it. I've been kind of a beneficiary of the work that the BYHMC has been able to do, but there are rival groups that have contradictory plans and have criticized this project very much. There was some controversy as the leadership changed in the BYHMC recently, and that caused a number of historians to leave. There are fears that the sort of shift to virtual reality is not a correct form of memorial policy, but I think the idea is really to get young people involved and to understand about history. And I got some actually quite positive responses from some of the work I've published from Ukrainians. They said, finally, history is interesting again. So I think that there is a need to do this in a way that a younger generation can understand. And I think with time, the sort of the heavy load of all this memory politics is not going to play such a big role for the younger generation. So I'm positive that despite all the continuing political arguments over this, that if we can create a lasting memory site and get at least some of these projects realized, it will be an important achievement for Ukraine. And I think, although people are saying, well, it's sort of pressure from Europe that's making them do this, I think that there is quite a few young people in Ukraine who really want to see this done, and that's important.
Thank you. I'm going to give a moment in case there are other questions or comments from Norman, Yulia, Catherine, if you want to chime in.
If I can,
Please.
I'd like to ask you, Martin, again, I've not been able to be in Ukraine and see recently and see how the project is evolving. And what is your sense about I mean, one thing has nothing to do with the other, but does the Russian, incursions or the Russian threats of the last, weeks, especially the kind of increasing pressure put on Ukraine, will that have any effect, or does that have an effect on the project? I mean, the stuff I was reading about, the criticism of the project as a, in quotes, Russian project, right? That the Russian oligarchs are behind it and that kind of thing. I wonder what this present, difficulty with the Russians might, how that might influence the project itself. I mean, do you have any sense of that?
It's difficult from here to really judge it. When I was there, I was present at a press conference when all the oligarchs came forward and professed their deep Ukrainian roots with great convincing showmanship. They were all very, very well schooled media performers, so they're aware of the problem and addressing it. What I have noticed too is that this Russian pressure really does bring the Ukrainians together and makes them quite defiant. So Putin may be getting exactly the opposite of what he wants in terms of the mentality of the Ukrainians, that even the people in East Ukraine are much more feel Ukrainian than they did a few years ago, I think. But of course, if he does march in with tanks, then I'm not too optimistic about the future of the project.
I am going to step in and ask a couple questions. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask two things. One, could you talk a little bit about those Hela photos and, when they were discovered and where they ended up, and, when particularly, the people in the West became aware of them? And then the second question is, I wonder how many sources you have of eyewitness testimonies from locals who were there at the time. And, I understand that, the Soviets probably didn't collect them, but are there any sorts of testimonies that survived or got out of the Soviet Union? Thank you.
Those are two excellent questions. So the Hela photographs really came to public knowledge in the 1990s. It was kind of a byproduct of this Wehrmacht exhibition. I think it was more the second Wehrmacht exhibition, which was trying to correct the errors of the first Wehrmacht exhibition. I knew both Hannes Herr, who did the first exhibition. I'm good friends with Andrew Angrick and Peter Klein, the people who worked on the second exhibition. And the photographs were from Germany, and I think they had been used maybe in a court case in Germany earlier on, but the Hamburg Institute for Social Research was able to get copies and really have done a great job in making them available to people and doing everything they can to research it. They even found some other documentation about Hela. It's still unclear what his motives in doing this were. It seems he was just out for a stroll and took these pictures because he was interesting, but he obviously knew what happened the day before and does document it. So I would say his position is kind of neutral. He was a propaganda photographer, but he also took quite moving pictures at the Lubny execution a few weeks later. So he does seem to have this knack of turning up and doing not exactly what a propaganda photographer is supposed to do, because these are not good German propaganda. These are really more documentary type films. So we have to be grateful for his I think probably quite risky dedication to take the photographs. Not saying that I don't know really anything about his political beliefs, but he did seem to be moved by it, I think. In terms of, so what was the second question was?
Do you have any eyewitness accounts from local Ukrainians?
There are quite a lot of local accounts. They're obviously scattered in different archives. Nakmanovich did put a lot on the website, which are available in Russian and are fairly useful, collected over a number of years, many of them from the KGB archives. There may be more good material in the KGB archives because the way it's organized makes it hard to find exactly what you're looking for. But they did actually find recently some other cases in the KGB archives of Ukrainians who denounced or even murdered Jews on their own initiative, more or less, just after the massacre. So certainly, and that was found out by researchers working for the BYHMC. So there are more things to be found in the KGB archives. There's no doubt about that. And there are other sources as well, which we've been using. I actually use things from the Centropa archive. They only have mostly the testimonies of Jews who managed to escape from Kiev, but even those shed light on the mood in the city just before they left, and especially they report what happened to their families. And there are many important collections. The Shoah Foundation has some. Father Dubois, as I mentioned, has some. So it's more a problem. There are so many different archives to look at. It's hard for any one person to get an overview. But that's one thing they're really doing a good job of now in Kiev is trying to centralize all its material and digitize it so that you can really get a better handle on it. And I'm very excited to explore their amazing collection of names of victims, for example, which has been made possible by opening both the archives in Kiev and getting a lot of help, obviously, from Yad Vashem as well.
Thank you. Well, we have gone a few minutes over, and so I am going to wrap this up since my children are home now, and that is how it works in the virtual age. But I do want to thank you so much for this insightful talk. The museum project, I think when it gets closer to being complete, I hope that you can come and share more about it physically in person at Stanford. Thank you to Yulia Ilchuk, Catherine Jolek, and to Norman Neymark. On behalf of CREASE, Slavic Studies, the History Department, and the Toby Center for Jewish Studies, I thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.